And if we think about emotional vocabulary, young children sort of get the basics. Sad, happy, mad, and sort of all the feelings get like lumped into that. But there's so many more feelings than that. And when I start my work with parents, one of the things that we often discover is our emotional vocabulary also isn't as strong or as wide as we think it is.
Welcome to the Baby Sleep Connection, a podcast that explores baby sleep and more through the lens of attachment and development. I'm your host, Heather Boyd. I'm a mom of 3, an occupational therapist, and a certified infant and family sleep specialist. If you are a tired parent who wants to support your baby sleep holistically, keep listening as we delve into approaches that go well beyond the usual strategies of wake windows and bedtime routines. Your baby's sleep is connected with so much more.
I am excited to welcome Tara Gratto on to the podcast today. Welcome, Tara.
Hello! Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. I wonder if you can give us a little tidbit of who you are,
Sure.
what you do, and who you serve.
It's funny, I was when you said, okay, you need to introduce yourself, I was like, oh, it's evolved a lot. So my name is Tara. I am a parent and education consultant, I'm going to say, because I've started also working in the education sphere more. I come from education. I'm a trained teacher. I have a master's in education. I have worked with all the ages and stages. I ran a preschool for 7.5 years. I worked in classrooms, in guidance and administration, K through 12. So I've worked with lots of children and families, and then for the last 3.5 years, I've been working exclusively with parents and supporting them with tools for feelings, kindness, and everyday mental well-being. So
I love this because although most of the families I work with are adjusting to this huge role of parenthood and raising little ones and not getting good sleep, I know that almost everyone who works with me is also looking at how to raise their baby to be kind, to be able to make their way in the world, and to have, I'm going to bring up the big word that we're going to talk about today, to have resilience.
Yes. Yeah, and I think one of the things I learned when I was a preschool owner was I made the aha moment then. So I've been talking about feelings for over 20 years. I joke. I've been talking about feelings longer than it's been cool and trendy, because now it's cool and trendy, which is so exciting. But it's really interesting because one of the things I discovered when I owned a preschool was when you help parents with young children understand social emotional intelligence or social emotional development, that makes everyone's life easier. Makes your life easier, makes your child's life easier, and the spaces in which they go. Daycare, nannies, extracurricular, all the different spaces. So it makes everyone's life easier because one of the things we've discovered is emotions, emotional intelligence is a huge component of who we are. So we used to talk a lot about IQ. Now we're realizing EQ, emotional quotient, is right up there with importance. And for me, it was the missing puzzle for a lot of parents in sort of navigating parenting a new way, in a supportive way. It was sort of the missing piece for them to be like, oh, this is what I'm trying to do. But also tricky because I never learned it myself. I never learned it myself because it wasn't cool and trendy until recently.
Well, and as you talk about this, I think about parents wanting to do it the right way, but feeling somehow if it is a natural process to work towards interdependence and cooperation and kindness, why it's not unfolding on its own. You take a very, I'm going to say, deliberate approach, like very tangible and deliberate. I wonder if you can speak to kind of, it's going down to the nuts and bolts of actually being able to conceptualize what this all means and what we do about it.
Yeah, for sure. I think, so one of the things I like to say to parents, because it really reduces the guilt, shame, and blame, is you are very likely, still might have, partners often have different sort of perspectives on emotions, this idea that the more you suppressed your feelings, the stronger of a person you are, right? So a lot of people come from the mindset that like we shouldn't know or identify our feelings because that makes us weak. Or, you know, we shouldn't use certain language because that sort of shows a side of our personality or encourages weakness or a lack of functioning in society, I'm going to say. But one of the things I've discovered is it doesn't have to be so, you know, black and white, so linear. There is no either or. I'm all about striking a balance. So one of the things I say to parents in the beginning is, you don't know this stuff because you probably weren't raised with it, unless you did a lot of sort of research into therapy or you sort of had a special interest in emotional intelligence. Society, until very recently, didn't really teach this stuff. However, a lot of parents right now are trying to implement it. They're trying to validate children's experiences. They're trying to support kids with their choices and their beliefs and their independence and really foster some of those things. Now, here's the tricky piece. I'm going to say it's run away a little bit. We've kind of let emotions take over in some cases, which is why a lot of parents are like, I can't even get out the door in the morning, right? We've also put a lot of things that are, I'm going to say, not age appropriate on very little minds. And what I mean by that is, we have to support this as a journey. So one of the things we've learned about neuroscience is brain development. You got to hold on to your seat for a second, because this is going to probably make you take a little bit of a breath. It takes 25 years for the full maturation of the brain. But we sometimes speak to very, very little people like they have a fully matured brain, because we'll see something on social media that'll be like, oh, I need to have this big conversation with my child. I need to, and it's not that we don't validate kids. Kids are awesome, they're smart, they're amazing, they're intuitive, but they're not wise. They're not wise beyond their brain development or maturity. So one of the things I sort of talk about is we do a lot of assuming as parents, and we don't do it on purpose. You all have super smart kids. Everyone does. But here's the thing. They haven't had life experience, lived experience like you, right? You've had lots of lived experience. You've navigated great and not great stress, right? You've figured out some tools, maybe actively figured some out, or maybe not so actively, it just happened through life experience. But one of the tricky pieces is when we're thinking about how do we support children, is we have to think of it as a life skill. And like all great life skills, it means we have to teach it. And that's what I discovered when I was working with families, is we often assume kids know so much. And really, I call it stating the obvious. Unless you've told them, they don't know. Even if you think they know, until you tell them, don't assume they do.
That makes a lot of sense, Tara. And as you're talking about this idea of kids are not wise and that this is going to take time, and how incredible it is that we now know just how long it takes to get there. There's so much I want to ask you, Tara. I'm going to take a side trip here, because one of the tools that you use to be able to support parents in understanding social emotional development and then bridging that to teaching it to their kids is the use of books.
Yes.
I wonder if you could tell us what role it plays, how it helps parents.
Sure.
And then tell us a little bit about the book that you wrote.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to take it back just a couple of steps. So from that assumption thing I was just talking about, where we assume a lot. And one of the things that we assume about ourselves and others is that we have a great, what I call, emotional vocabulary. It's not me. There's lots of people who call it emotional vocabulary. I'm not the forefront thinker on this. But it is one of those things where I call it a vocabulary because it helps people think about language, right? And if we think about emotional vocabulary, young children sort of get the basics. Sad, happy, mad. We can sort of add a little bit of worry in there, and then we can sometimes add a little calm. And sort of all the feelings get like lumped into that. But there's so many more feelings than that. And when I start my work with parents, one of the things that we often discover is our emotional vocabulary also isn't as strong or as wide as we think it is. So one of the things about developing tools for our feelings is we have to be able to identify our feelings. And this even counts for like little people. So if you have a very tiny person, your first job is to start to think about, can you identify your feelings? And one fun way to do that is to start teaching your child, right? Even before they're pre-verbal. This can start with babies because they're listening, and part of you reflecting on your feelings is starting to build your emotional vocabulary, build it out. Because one of the things I have found when I work with parents is when you first ask them, hey, what do you think about how well you can identify your feelings? Typically they'll be like, yes, pretty high. Then we'll sort of go through the motions, and they're like, after a few weeks, they're like, maybe not as high as I originally thought, actually. So there's this great theory by Dr. Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson called Name It to Tame It. If you've been on social media, you have probably seen it. We should label children's feelings in difficult moments. It helps them to regulate. Lots of layers to this particular theory. And one of the things I found when I had my preschool is it didn't work super well. And here's what I discovered. It works super well when kids have an emotional vocabulary and when adults have an emotional vocabulary. It doesn't work super well when we're trying to label other people and how they feel. And the example I like to use is if you're ever in a disagreement with another person, partners often, if a partner tells you how you are feeling in that moment, generally doesn't make you feel better. In fact, usually makes you feel more escalated. So I transitioned this to kids. With very young kids, I have found under the age of 3-ish, I'm saying ish, because I don't believe in any single age being any specific milestone. And I know this is something that resonates with you, Heather, in your sort of work. Every kid's different, right? I say 3-ish, 3 to 5-ish. It can work to label a kid's feelings because they're still building their emotional vocabulary, just as you would label like the fruit in the fridge or at the grocery store, and you'd be sort of, I call it narrating the world to help them build their vocabulary. Then there's this little thing that happens somewhere between 3 and 5 where they kind of get pretty angry, actually, when you label their feelings for them. And when you look at the theory a little bit more closely, what you discover is, in order for it to work as a tool for emotional regulation, you, the person feeling the feelings, needs to be the one who identifies the feeling. So if somebody says to you, hey, you're mad, you might not be identifying with that word mad. Maybe you're identifying with the word frustrated, or scared, or anxious, or worried, or who knows, right? And here's another fun fact. Somewhere around 70% of the time, we are not right about labeling other people's feelings. So
it's a pretty high rate of not getting it right if you're young.
Yeah, for sure. And it's tricky because a lot of parents will be like, well, I know my kid. And one of the things I love to sort of reflect on and think about as we go through this journey, and I'm going to get to the picture books, I promise, is how well can you identify your own feelings? Like truly in the moment, how well can you? And are you better at maybe the ones you don't enjoy experiencing as much as the ones you do? Right? There's some pieces there. And one of the things that sort of Mark Brackett talks a lot about is this idea of like, there are no good or bad feelings, but they're all a guide, a tool. When I talk to parents, I'm like, we all know there are some feelings we like to feel and other feelings we do not like to feel. Guide or no guide, we still automatically go there, right? I don't want that angry feeling, that frustrated feeling, that, those bigger behavioral related feelings. So the first place we start is, hey, how well can you identify your feelings? Because in order for you to regulate, you need to be able to do that. And then if we want our kids to be empowered with this, how well can we help them develop their vocabulary? Now, I don't know about you. I know a lot about kids. If it's not fun and engaging, they don't want to do it. They're not interested, right? And some parents will say to me, but I'm not a teacher. Well, you are your child's guide for life. So you don't have to be an academic teacher to be their guide and teacher in life. So one of the things that's really helpful is to think about ways of doing things that are fun, engaging, and effective. Picture books are one of my favorite tools for a couple of reasons. One, there's pictures. Who doesn't love art? The other thing is, you know how when you're talking to someone and you're like looking at them and it feels a bit lectury sometimes, or the conversation feels really like pressured because you're looking at somebody? Kids tune out. If you look at them, they don't always pay attention to the person talking to them. And they're not being disrespectful, and they're not being, avoiding you and no, that's not what's happening. They're just quite simply not engaged. Put a, important conversation behind a picture book, and suddenly you have automatic engagement, right? It's that less pressured, you're in a teaching moment where you're side by side. The other thing I like to say is we build tools in calm and connection. When we're reading a book, we're calm and connected, right? Our tendency, and you'll probably find this as you start to think about your own feelings and starting to label your feelings, our tendency is to label feelings in difficult moments, tricky moments. Unfortunately, our brain is not working in those moments, and it's definitely not in a learning zone, right? So if we're trying to teach our kid about their feelings, and we're using difficult moments to label their feelings, there's a piece of the puzzle that's missing. And that's part of my book.
that also tends to be where we try to make it a teachable moment.
Like
we need to fix this problem, and we're going to choose it now when their brain is on fire with
Right.
emotions and with firing, and ours possibly too, and we just can't take in new information. In fact, it reminds me of another piece that Dan Sagal has put together, which is the flipping your lid.
Exactly.
Energy.
Yes, right. And that's what I call Dino Brain, right? My comic picture book is The Adventures of Teen Brain. It's for 4+ and caring adults. A lot of caring adults have gotten a lot out of my book, because it's this idea that when our brain flips, we are in the stress cycle, right? And often we associate stress with work and financial and stuff. What we don't think about is there's lots of everyday things that actually flip us. And we don't have to be angry to be in the stress cycle. We don't have to be, we could just not want to put on our shoes for a child. That could be enough to flip them into Dino Brain. And we're trying to use that moment to teach them a tool for regulation. We're trying to use that moment to teach them about what feeling they're feeling. So you can imagine why that sometimes runs its course in not great outcomes. It's not the right moment. So I use books. I have 2 tools I'm going to talk about today. One of them is using books. And you can use books, again, with pre-verbal. That means before language, before speaking, before you can use books, because they're visual, they're colorful, and it's about your voice and what you're using. So one of my favorite books is The Way I Feel by Jana and Kane. It is a book about feelings. There is 2 versions. There's a board book version. So if you're a listener that has very little, the board book might be the best option for you. The picture book is my favorite because it has some of the more nuanced emotions, like jealousy, for example, grateful and thankful. So it has some more of the sort of layered emotions that we need to build that emotional vocabulary with. So if you have a little person, The Way I Feel. And there's so many different ways. I'm actually going to be putting together a resource, 5 ways you can use The Way I Feel. So that'll be on my website soon. I will give you the link, Heather.
Wonderful. When I for those that, I'll be honest, when it comes to books, the value that I get out of it, even if my kids have no interest in reading it with me at all, it gives me a template or a starting point for even giving myself the
language
idea or the language and the perspective. It kind of opens up a lot of doors for me to start even just thinking about it, so that when an opportunity arises, I've already got a bit of a, maybe
tool.
not intentional plan, but definitely a tool that I get to pull out.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things, another reason I use board books picture books, I should say. I mean, I have hundreds. I adore them as an adult. But the thing is, a lot of people will say to me, well, you tell me not to assume my kids know stuff. And you tell me, but I want to still, I don't want to treat them like, I don't want to be disrespectful. I want to honor them. And here's the thing about picture books. They are written in age-appropriate language. So those people who are like, okay, I need some way of having this conversation, the beautiful thing about a picture book is it's designed with the right language in mind. And even for some people that's still uncomfortable because they're like, oh, I'm not ready for this topic. And that's some of the sort of bigger social emotional topics. But when we're talking about feelings, having the vibrant pictures in The Way I Feel is awesome. Another one of my favorites, it's an oldie, but it's a goodie, is How Did Dinosaurs Say I'm Mad? Because it goes through, you can play it a little sing-songy, a little playful, and at the end there's like the tool, right? Well, what do we need to do? So that's an older one. Again, it's great for like the smaller audience. When Sadness is at Your Door is another great book. Again, it's the simplified language, and what we're doing here is we're talking about feelings and we're building that feelings vocabulary. So I use picture books because it helps kids look at the pictures, gives you an opportunity to do some, I call it feelings detective work, and kids will see things that you might not see, which is one of my favorite things about reading with children, is when they see something and tell me about it and sort of engaging in that process. One thing I'm going to give you a little caveat warning here. When you start to use books for social emotional intelligence, so building out your feelings vocabulary, building out kindness, empathy, right? How do others feel in that moment? There can be a tendency to want to over talk the book because you start to see how exciting it can be, especially if you have a 3 to 8-year-old. Try to only focus on 1 or 2 extra conversations per reading. Because otherwise, suddenly you'll have a child who's not reading that anymore because what's happened is become a lecture. Right? So
yes.
That's my little caveat warning, because some people get really excited. They're like, oh, this works amazing. I'm like, it does. But you got to make sure it's a balance of that connected, engaged reading and the learning journey. Teachers can get away with a bit more. So teachers, the people who say, but I see the librarian, I'm like, it's totally different because they're there for a different purpose.
Well, that picks up on, the reason that I think that you've been able to conceptualize so much of this is because of your daycare background.
Right.
Because unlike parents, where we have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 kids as our tool for learning about all of this stuff, trial by fire, a daycare provider or teacher gets a huge number of kids that they get to know, that they get to figure out, and they get to learn the bigger picture. And so for parents that are feeling like, and I have this conversation all the time when kids transition to daycare and parents are like, they're eating differently at the daycare and they're sleeping better and I don't know what I'm doing wrong. You're not doing anything wrong. Your role is different, your connection is different, and your experience is different. And it will always look different than it does in daycare.
For sure. I call it positive peer pressure. There's
Yes,
negative
I
there's
do too.
there's negative peer pressure, and then there's positive peer pressure. That's all the like, oh, my friends are doing this, so I'm going to do it. And parents are like, why can't you do that for me? Yeah, no, it's 100%
true. You don't have
true.
10 other kids that are leading the way to bedtime or the lunch table.
For sure. It's also the safe space aspect, right? So when kids go out and they have a teacher role, right, who they have a certain relationship with, they show less of, right? They do more following, less pushback, less. And I think that is one of the complexities or difficulties with being a parent is like, how do you strike that careful balance between validating that safe space while also not letting too many boundaries become loose because they're pushing back, right? Those limits, that's a whole other conversation though.
Yes,
so we'll put a pin in that one because I'll open a big kettle of
boundaries was something I thought might come up, but there is something I want to unpack a little bit too, because a lot of your focus or the lens that you're looking at things through, in addition to kindness, in addition to the vocabulary around feelings, is this concept of resilience.
Right.
And I know that could be an entire conversation on its own, but perhaps you could give us a sense of what is it and how are we getting it wrong?
Oh, I don't usually head for the negative lens. So I have a concept in my mind, and it's called Raising Resilient Children. And it actually used to be my brand, and I transitioned, but it's still in the background of the things I do, and it's going to be a part of my online sort of learning module things that I've created. But one of the things that I am seeing in the world, sort of, and I've seen it slowly over the last 20 plus years, we're going to say plus. I was doing the math the other day. I was like, ooh, it's a lot more than 20. That's okay. We sort of, as we transform our parenting styles, there's this very difficult balance that's come out that's maybe less balanced than it needs to be. And it's funny, I have a lot of podcasts with a good friend of mine, Amy, who's an educator, on my podcast. And one of the things we've talked about is as we've aged, we now appreciate the importance of balance where we did not previously. We were more linear thinkers, and now we understand balance a little bit more. So one of the things that I'm seeing is what I call over-present parenting. We are one of the most present parents in history, which is amazing. It's also not amazing. And why is it not amazing? Because we are doing things unintentionally. And I want to make this very clear. We are doing it unintentionally. We do not mean to be doing it. We are leading very busy and stressful and difficult, and the responsibilities on our shoulders are consuming. I'm the parent of 2 middle schoolers, so we are in the age of technology and all those layers. So it's added a lot of complexity to parenting right now. But one of the things we are doing is not letting kids fail at the very little things. And this is especially important for your younger audience. This was a big part of my preschool, is we fix a lot of things that kids need to learn how to fail when they're little. They need to learn how to not have everything work out. Because here's the thing, when everything works out for you when you're little, when you're a bit older, and I don't mean that much older, I mean like 5 to 8, it's very, very hard when things don't work out for you. You don't have the tools because you're not practiced at not having things work out, right? You're not practiced at having to wait your turn. You're not practiced at some of these things. And we fix them unintentionally. I'm going to give you an example. Getting out the door in the morning, right? It is often rushed. We are often going to be late for something, daycare, work, all the things. So we will get kids dressed because we're just trying to get kids dressed. And one of the things I say to parents is, okay, how can we step back a little bit? How can we rejig the getting dressed situation so that maybe we're half helping and half not? How are you putting more time in there? How are we building, I call it skill mastery? How are we making sure kids are mastering skills before we expect them to do it? Because if we fix things, this is one of the reasons we have kids who can't get dressed at the age that they need to get dressed, because somebody's always pulled it up for them. And they haven't been able to be frustrated with the process and gotten through that, right? So part of building your emotional regulation and part of building your emotions vocabulary is also not fixing the feelings that we don't love, right? It's not always, I'm going to use crying as an example. Crying is a very valid expression of emotion. It can be hard, and this is where that balance comes in. Where do we and how do we support what that looks like? And how do we start to recognize, this is a difficult moment, and that tears are a release of that moment. And that my job isn't to stop the tears, but be a supportive component of getting through the moment, right? I don't know if that's clear in what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. And Tara, it reminds me of a time when I think I had 3 by this point, so the morning rush was like crazy for getting out the door. Maybe it was only 2 kids. But I remember the mornings being so resistant. Like it was like pushing against a brick wall. And it took a long time. And I thought, what would happen if I stopped pushing?
Right.
And you know what? It didn't take any longer, and everyone was a lot happier, and there was more connection. And when you have more connection, there's more wiggle room for cooperation and getting where you need to go.
Yes.
And it was this aha moment, despite how long I've worked with families. As a parent, it's a totally different
Oh, it's not. It's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I just remember how it was this aha moment of, I don't have to be pushing, or fixing or doing. Being there for my kids doesn't mean doing for.
Yes.
Sometimes it does.
Right.
There's still that learning process and the help that they need when they literally can't do it. But there's also that ability to be there to validate the feeling and just be empathetic to them.
Yes. Without fixing it.
Without fixing it, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to give you another example. I have a podcast on this. It's called Be Careful. It's about, being careful and saying be careful.
I love this already. I was wondering, this is something I talk to my families about a lot too, the language around that.
So, I mean, a lot of people have a lot of different feelings about it. For me, one of the things I have found is be careful itself is not the problematic part. The problematic part is how often it's used. I think when used with intention, be careful is a very important word. But when we use it for absolutely everything, that's where it becomes tricky. So I'm going to give an example of how we sometimes unintentionally don't let kids fail at things that kids need to fail at. So I owned a preschool. It was an outdoor and play-based preschool. Well, it was a hybrid, actually. But we spent a good solid, probably 4 hours a day outside. And I had climbers and logs and all the things. Of course, there's, risk involved in that, and falling and tripping and some bruises and things like that. Part of play, which is a whole other conversation too. But the part I want to talk about here is I did not help children climb on the climber. Ever. I spotted them. In other words, if they were going up something very steep, I would be there just to make sure that there wasn't a humongous fall. But if you couldn't reach the top on your own, I did not make sure you could get there. There's a couple different reasons for this. When you look at natural play and sort of body development and things like that, there's a theory that says you shouldn't climb a tree until you can fall out of a tree. When we put kids on climbers at heights that they can't fall from, we are actually not teaching them how to mitigate risk effectively, which is how we get stressed out and say be careful more often, because we're not actually giving them the space to learn the tools to navigate risk, because we're fixing the obstacles for them. And I've worked with a lot of parents on this idea of but I really want my kid to have this great experience at the playground, and I really want to have my kid to have a great experience. Here's the thing. Not everything can be a great experience, because the great experience is failing. The great experience is working I cannot tell you the sense of accomplishment that those kids had. And some of them, it took a year. Like, I'm talking like some of them persisted and got frustrated and had, yes, fall on the ground crying moments about it when a couple friends were up and they were not. But when they were able to do it and they were able to problem solve, and also watching the kids, even barely verbal kids, helping each other with tools. No, put your foot here, right? Like, we take that away from them by being over present in certain circumstances. And this is one of my favorite examples to talk about. We don't do it on purpose. We are going to the playground to have fun with our children. What we don't realize is that we're also potentially preventing them from some really important learning, right?
I always think about this building, like the scaffolding of skill, when I think about this ability to allow the time for kids to develop the skill and to problem solve and to figure it out, and to have you there. Again, you can be there for them without doing it.
Yep.
They're going to see the smile on your face for the persistence that they have.
Right.
It's almost like redefining what a great experience is. Like, is it the cherry on top that matters, or is it that they figured out how to get to the ice cream on the bottom and then you build from there?
Right. And I mean, I have to like overly emphasize, it's not intentional. We're just going with the mindset of having a good time, of not wanting our kids to have that frustrated feeling of some people being up and some people being down, right? Like, but what we don't realize when we step back a few steps is, hey, my child needs to learn how to fail and get back up again. Because then I have a lot of parents between 5 and 7 who say to me, my kid won't do something unless it's perfect. Mm-hmm. And that's the foundation. That's the foundation. When we're not allowed to do stuff and not have an adult fix it for us who has lots of maturity and problem-solving skills, and you've done it 1,000 times, so you actually know better, right? If they don't start to learn how to draw a picture with, no goals in mind, no whatever, if they don't learn how to climb the climber on their own, that process translates to perfectionism later, right? This is why we have kids who are not willing to try hard things, because they're not used to, they haven't developed the emotional skills to handle hard things.
I'm going to draw a parallel here with the families that I work with around sleep, because I take a very attachment-based, developmentally based approach to sleep, and parents will often come to me when they're working to reframe what it looks like to support a baby in having their sleep development unfold. And they say, but I need to make them figure this out, falling asleep this particular way, or they'll never gain the skill. And they need to experience frustration. And so on some level, it's reminding me of the parents that I've coached through, where I've said, for very young babies, the world can be a very frustrating place. We don't need to contrive the situations that present frustrations. There are plenty. It's when they do arise that we can be there in a different way than fixing.
Yes.
But we don't need to contrive them. There's ample
multiple. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And I think that speaks to the point of, what I heard there, and this is the challenge of parenting right now, is how do you know what's developmentally appropriate? How do you know what's age appropriate? And this is where I say, okay, like you just said, you don't need to contrive frustration, right? If we step back from play, just play, right? Kids going to the playground is for their play. Now, play doesn't always have to look joyful. We believe it does, but it doesn't. And so, because that's where the learning how to handle risk and failure and disappointment and frustration, that's where all of that language becomes so important, right, in supporting our child there, right, and understanding that in terms of developmental appropriateness, they being independent, like people say to me, I need my child to be independent, and that's a perfect example of where we need to step back from our adult over guidance, because that is their space, right? And maybe at night with you and your work, that's not where we step back differently, right? And that is not my zone at all. So I will not touch the sleep. I go up until bedtime. That's where my line draws. I draw at bedtime. I'll help you get to bedtime, and then I step back, because that's not my area of expertise. But one of the things I do talk a lot about is, like, where are these age-appropriate choices? It comes up in choices as well. What's an age-appropriate choice? an age-appropriate choice is something that you're not going to say no to. If you're going to say no to it, it wasn't an age-appropriate choice, right? That's a really helpful tool for a lot of people. They'll be like, well, how can I, they're playing. I'm like, yes, choosing the color of your crayon, that's an age-appropriate choice, right? If you're going to say no, then that wasn't a choice you could give, right? So a helpful tool is, what's an age-appropriate choice? Something you're not going to say no to. And if you are going to say no to it, then it's probably not an age-appropriate choice. It's probably an adult decision.
Good guide. Yeah, that's a good practical guide for that. There's a few key things I want to unpack a little bit, although you may jump in with some other thoughts that I haven't even had yet. I'm curious to know what it is that you see, in addition to this conversation around feelings and resilience and boundaries, that you think is like the missing ingredient for parents right now that would shift things into an easier dynamic for parents themselves who are struggling with this?
Like overall, you mean? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. I have a lot of conversations about the pandemic and what the pandemic did and didn't do. And one of the things I say is the pandemic exacerbated a lot of things, but it did not create a lot of things. And I think on this same thread of what we've just been talking about, this sort of over-present/present parenting, is we are so present that we're not drawing boundaries, one, and we are so present we're not actually connected. So there's a big difference between being present and being connected, and authentic connection is not hours a day, and it shouldn't cost you a dime. This is very important, because as kids get older, and it's interesting, I have a white paper about this, which I've been asked to republish, and it's this idea that we have this idea that starts in parental leave that we must maximize every single moment as much as possible. And that usually translates to a lot of financial stress for a lot of people, because maximizing moments means making sure you're doing 1,000 things. And as kids get older, it means doing big ticket things. And I call it the pressure cooker parenting. We're constantly pressured to do, because that is how our children will value their childhood. And what I'm suggesting is we need to step back from that, because true connection isn't a trip to anything. It's 5 or 10 minutes a day of a conversation. And it's about the language you're using. So if you are a listener, and I know a lot of your audience will have sort of babies, how you speak, I call it again, stating the obvious. Don't assume your child knows that you're present unless you're telling them. What does that look like? One of my favorite parts of the day is reading stories with you. We're stating the obvious. It may seem clear that when you're reading a story every day that they should know. Those of you who are slightly older, or maybe you have a sibling, right? Maybe you have more than one baby, so you're sort of listening in and you're doing the multiple. One of the things you'll notice is as kids are getting older, because they're so used to parents and adults being present, they're rather demanding. And at times, uncomfortably so. I call it the beck and call parenting, where a lot of parents feel like they must do absolutely everything on a dime or their child's going to sort of have a meltdown. And again, it comes down to this like guilt over types of connection and presence, especially with the style of working and the need, all the things, right? So one of the things I sort of come down to is we need to build our feelings vocabulary, and we need to build intentional connection. And that intentional connection does not need to be hours and hours, and it should not cost you any money.
So much is coming up just in practical examples with my kids, but also something that I coach a lot of my families with who are trying to find that balance. That the play, and engage, eye contact, face-to-face, and I'll coach them to at least take some of the time to sit back, depending on the age of the child and how proximal they want to be, but at least take a figurative step back to be a curious observer of the play, because then you can not be trying to involve yourself or do with. There's plenty of opportunities for that, but you get to just watch and enjoy it and savor it, and that moment when they look up to check in on what's happening around them and they see that look of delight on your face, that's nonverbal communication out the zing. But I think also about this shift as the kids get older, that being available looks quite different. I kind of miss the period of parenting where I could clean the kitchen with headphones on and listen to music because they were so immersed in Lego that it was like I didn't exist. We're getting into the teenage years in my house, and I need those headphones off so I am present on the periphery. So that as they pass by, those incidental conversations happen. But we also now have, and this I guess fits in with the boundary piece, we have an expectation that even though they know that they're going to be going down to play video games, we're connecting at the table first. All of us, even if it's only 5 minutes to hash out what's happening this weekend so that everybody kind of knows what's going on. And then off you go, but we've connected briefly, very briefly.
And there's no resentment as a result. No. There's no resentment when you're not always demanding that, right? It's also, that what you're talking about is fostering independence, right? When they were younger and playing. And a lot of people struggle with that. A lot of people struggle. They're like, I have to be there. And I'm going to say something highly controversial. Are you ready for it? You don't have to play with your child. And you don't have to play the way they tell you. And you don't have to play things that they want you to play simply because they want you. Now, when I say you don't have to play with your child, I mean you don't have to play dolls if you don't want to play dolls. You don't have to build Lego if you don't want to build Lego. You need to play with your child in a way that feels authentic to you. Not try to play in a way that's not authentic. Because, and this again, slightly controversial, when you force yourself to do something you passionately dislike, first of all, you're giving off that vibe. You're super resentful. In your brain, you are building up such a level of resentment that it will come out negatively in almost, like it's sort of a given, if you will. But it's also not allowing them to develop their imagination. Now, I know there are some adults who are like, no, I am all in for the imaginative play. Give me the dolls. I love it. Cool. That's great. If that really authentically resonates with you and you really authentically want to engage in that, go for it. Do not force yourself because it takes away from their imaginative play experience. Do things that build connection and enjoyment that's mutually enjoyable. So that's my very controversial hot take.
Well, and I tend to align a lot with that, Tara. I think about, when I've guided parents around even something like horseplay and roughhousing.
Yep.
And I always say, like, if it's a two-parent household, which of the parents is more
enjoying
into
it?
that?
Mm-hmm.
Let that be their thing.
Yep.
You don't even have to touch that thing.
Yep.
But let that be their thing. You don't have to feel like you're missing out because they're having such a good time doing it and you just don't. But maybe you should.
No.
No, you shouldn't.
Yeah.
Just connect in the way that's meaningful for you.
Exactly. And again, you don't have to do all the things with the kids. And I think that's where that, how am I building intentional connection versus I'm being overly present all the time? Because that is a lead-in to why kids don't play independently, right? Because they're being taught from very, very young ages that that's what adults do. Adults entertain me, right? Kids who go to daycare or have nannies or have someone caring for them, we generally don't say to that person, hey, did you make sure my kid had a boring day today? That's generally not what we say, even though we probably should. Actually, we should be like, hey, where was the boredom in the day today? We don't say that, though, because we're invested in their future outcomes. And again, another sort of conversation for another day. But what that relationship is teaching kids is from a very young age, adults entertain me always. And when we reinforce that at home and we don't strike boundaries in our evenings, again, we're reinforcing that my job is to entertain you to the point of exhaustion or discomfort or do things that I authentically dislike doing versus, hey, I'm going to be intentional about my connection. We're going to do this thing that we both shared enjoy, and then you can go do your thing, or you can do something with another parent or person or caring adult that's a better fit for those people. So again, it's that emotional intelligence, how are we fostering that, and how are we building intentional connection?
Well, and I think that idea around boundaries, which I know, again, we could have a whole conversation on boundaries.
Many conversations.
I think so much about, about the parents who are trying to find a template to put on their parenting. They want a step
doesn't
by step
exist.
because it's so hard. And it doesn't exist. There's no cookie cutter.
Nope.
And so when I picture parents who are listening to this podcast saying, oh, okay, so I've got to do this and it's got to look like this. Oh, I need boundaries. I think, okay, boundaries are going to look very different at different ages,
stages,
for different kids, different temperaments, and different families.
100%.
And I think finding a way where you can take the information and then you create something that is unlike any other family on the earth, because the nuance is going to be different inside your family.
Absolutely. And that's tricky, because I know parents that are listening are like, great, you gave me all this information and then you just sort of didn't help me. Again, it comes down to, what does intentional connection look like for you? What kind of balance do you need to strike? If you're trying to figure out where, this is like just a very, very quick, because boundaries is literally like a huge component of the work that I do with parents. But if you are not striking a balance with boundaries, you are probably overwhelmed, you are probably exhausted, you probably feel like every time your kid says or does something, you have to jump because you're going to otherwise have meltdowns and challenges. That is a sign that your boundaries are not working. So if you're kind of like, I don't know what to take away from this, that's one of the things. But as Heather said, we're all different and we all have different family goals, and that's why I don't have a book, because I'm like, there is no manual for this. But there are some really important things, and boundaries is very, very important for fostering resilience, which is really interesting, because a lot of people think, well, if I'm pushing people down, and that's the wrong take on boundaries, right? Boundaries are setting age-appropriate limits for respecting all kinds of things, including yourself.
Yeah, and we tell parents, boundaries are not about putting up a wall.
Yeah.
It's about containing yourself, which is a skill you're going to want your kids to be able to develop. You want them to have healthy boundaries too.
100%.
And it doesn't mean pushing away.
Correct.
It means connection in the way that fits with everyone's needs being respected and understood.
And also understanding that there are developmentally appropriate limits. And we need, that is a very important lesson to learn. What is age appropriate? Because I think that's where the deep end of trickiness comes. Can I give a quick tool?
Yes, absolutely.
Because I have books, but you also have, my other tool is called narration. And this is particularly helpful for parents who are sort of developing their emotional vocabulary. Maybe you don't have a child who's reading yet. You can read to all ages and stages, just throwing that in there. But let's say your narration is where you say your feelings as you go through the day. And there's a couple things that happen when you do this. One is you got to be intentional about your inner voice when you're saying it out loud. Whether you have a baby, a toddler, a preschooler, an early elementary, or all the way up. One of the things you want to get intentional about, that's that common connection, not dino brain. The common connection is we're going to be intentional about narrating a variety of different emotions as we go through our day. That helps kids start to be able to understand and build empathy and awareness, right? How do other people feel? What do those words mean? It also helps with a tool for emotional regulation, because when you're saying your feelings out loud, you're typically going to follow it with some kind of solution, right? I'm super frustrated that the package was late. I think I need to take a step back and breathe 10, 9, 8, 7, right? So what you're doing is you're saying you're frustrated, you identified the feeling, then you said, what are you going to do about it? You need to take a step back, you're going to do some counting or some breathing. So you showed the different stages. And that's typically what happens. Another great example is, I am so excited to see Grandma today. I have that extra body energy. I think I need to go for a walk. All right? You're using another everyday tool, and we're talking about a quote-unquote happy feeling and how sometimes those feelings can give us extra energy, right? So another very helpful tool, especially for the very little, is this. It's also very helpful for partners. Because again, remember that misidentifying of emotions? Yes. That's one of the biggest aha moments when I work with couples. They're like, oh, I was getting my partner's feelings wrong quite a bit, actually. So.
Well, and that's not even touching on how often we are either unaware of our own feelings, or we are getting them wrong because we haven't really broken it down. I think of the number of times with families who are going through huge shifts or change or stress, and it's like, hold on, let's pause and break this down a little bit. Because where is this, what feelings are coming up for you and where are they coming from?
Right.
Because then we can have a little bit of a roadmap on how to navigate.
Undo it. And it's interesting that you say that, because I recently moved, which is big life transition. And our move had a lot of complexities. We had lived in our house for 12 years. Our kids had lived in the same area, same schools, all the things. And the statement that I kept getting repeatedly, and this is the perfect example of what we're talking about today, is I can't believe how well your children can verbalize what they're feeling. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this and say that those feelings came out in a nice way all the time. They did not. They were not pleasant to be around, but they were clearly identifying multiple layers of feelings. They were clearly identifying what those feelings were doing to them. And it repeated people, from the real estate agent to like all the people in the world who I didn't really think about it, right? I hadn't really stopped to think. I mean, my kids have had this stuff since forever because this is what my master's work was in 20 years ago. So it's like not just my preschool, it's just like my passion. But what I didn't realize and what people started to point out to me is that's what's so valuable. Understanding what feelings you're feeling doesn't mean they're going to go away. Doesn't mean there's going to be no yelling and there's not going to be slamming doors and things aren't going to get thrown. That doesn't mean any of that. And I think that's part of the misnomer that's happening in the world is like, hey, we're going to support all the feelings and everything's going to be magical. No, I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. And again, we're looking at that maturation of 25 years, right? The goal isn't to suppress feelings. If we're building tools for feelings actively, those not awesome reactions are going to take time to build tools for, right? They're going to take time. But it is really astounding to think about, hey, how differently a child, a person can process change, transition, difficulty, hardship when they have the right language to talk about it versus what is wrong with me, which I think resonates with a lot of people. A lot of people are like, I have this childhood and I don't know what was wrong with me, right?
Well, and I think about the number of parents that may be listening that they're like, okay, as my child gets, if I have a newborn at home, that's for later, but
No, it's not, please.
Anyone start now.
Yeah.
Even if it's only to focus on your own feelings so that you're starting to understand your own body, your own feelings, because that's like a playground for what you're going to be supporting your kids in as they go through all these stages.
I mean, and that's what they say, right? They're like, you can only co-regulate or regulate as well as you can yourself, right? So if you're looking at parenting differently and you're sort of reflecting on the things that you're hoping to do differently, and not to say that anyone's childhood is bad, some were, right? There is a lot of layers in a lot of people's lives. But one of the things I do say is it doesn't have to have looked a certain way, but I guarantee it was missing social emotional intelligence. And when we're looking at the trajectory of the world, when we're thinking about where's our world going, that is something that came out of the pandemic. Companies and managers with high levels of social emotional intelligence were the most successful in supporting their employees through that very difficult time, right? And when we're looking at what are colleges caring about now, it's not a list of 1,000 extracurriculars and volunteer. It's, can my kid think outside the box, or can the kid think outside the box? And what's their social emotional intelligence like? That's the stuff that we're starting to care about. If we're starting to care about that, we have to start building it from babies on up. I want the biggest takeaway today to be, hey, I can build an emotional vocabulary, and that's doable, and it's accessible, and it might make some of you feel very uncomfortable because we're just simply not used to it. And building an emotional vocabulary doesn't mean that you're going to be a more sensitive person or all the things that we like to categorize as people who have high emotional intelligence. You can be any kind of person and have a high level of emotional intelligence. It doesn't have to look like one type of personality. The other thing I want you to have to take away with is, how can I build intentional connection? What does that look like? And how can I build it in small increments? How can I be really intentional and less worried about hours and hours and hours, and more about blocks of time that I can really commit to in an authentic way?
Lovely, lovely. Okay, what's the best place that people can find you?
So my podcast is Tara's Take, Parenting, Education, and Life. That's on all the platforms. And then I'm on all the other places as Tara Gratto. So Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook. I have my website's Tara Gratto. Yeah, so you can find me by my name.
I'll include all those handles in the show notes. So people
Amazing.
Can find you easily. Thank you so much, Tara. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you. Awesome.
Bye for now.
Thank you for joining me on this episode. I do hope that you found the information and perspectives in this podcast episode helpful to you as you navigate your baby's sleep development. Of course, this podcast provides general information and it isn't tailored to your family's reality or the specific needs of your baby. If you're concerned about your baby's sleep or health, be sure to reach out to your healthcare provider. If you're feeling exhausted and overwhelmed and you need a place to feel nurtured and reassured, you can find me on Instagram at familysleep.ca. Until next episode, look for the connections that support you and your baby.